Welcome to the ICU podcast, where we explore the vestibular experience through conversations between patients and the health professionals who care for them.
During this podcast, we invite patients to share their stories and healthcare professionals to ask questions so they are equipped to better care for and truly see the invisible challenges faced by their patients. I'm Kimberly Warner.
And I'm Cynthia Ryan, and we are your hosts on this journey of discovery.
Welcome, everyone, to the ICU podcast. This is going to be such an incredible conversation today, one that is necessary. And sorry, guys, but this one is on menopause and perimenopause. So tune in for your wives and your girlfriends and your mothers and your daughters. But this won't be about you today. But it will affect you. I guarantee it. So every woman's experience of menopause, the menopause transition is unique. I just turned 40 when my symptoms began, and it's known that hormonal changes on the path to menopause can begin before menstrual irregularity, as early as your late 30s or early 40s. These changes affect sleep, mood, mental acuity, and subsequently, you guessed it, our vestibular systems, or how our brains interpret sensory input. Reports of the effect that women's hormones play on their vestibular systems are common, but symptoms vary. During different hormonal periods, some women report a new onset of symptoms, while others report a worsening of existing symptoms, and some even report improvement. Regardless, lack of information and education can contribute to misattribution, confusion, and definitely fear. But there is hope. New research is identifying the role estrogen may play in modulating vestibular symptoms and how women can optimize this chapter of their lives through lifestyle changes, hormone therapy, and finding healthcare practitioners who are versed in helping women through these powerful changes. Our two guests today are awesome. I'm so excited to have them here. They have a lot to share about this important phase of our lives and how our vestibular systems may be affected. Cynthia, do you want to start the introduction?
Yes, excellent. Thank you. I am so excited to have Dr. Maja Scrakic on our call today. She's a board certified neurotologist and one of the very few people that I have found who is an expert in the correlation between vestibular problems and hormone changes. She holds a faculty appointment at the Northwell Health Department of Otolaryngology at the Long Island Jewish Medical Center and is an Associate Professor of Otolaryngology at Zucker School of Medicine, where she is also the program director for the Residency in Otolaryngology and Head and Neck Surgery program. Dr. Svrakic immigrated from Belgrade, Serbia, graduated summa cum laude from Washington University in St. Louis, one of the big vestibular medical centers in the United States, and received her medical degree from Columbia University. She completed residency in otolaryngology at the Albert Einstein College of Medicine, a fellowship in neurotology at New York University, and a master's in health professions, pedagogy, and leadership at the Hofstra University School of Education. I tell you, becoming a neurotologist is a long, long journey. She has also authored numerous peer-reviewed scientific articles and book chapters. Welcome, Dr. Svrakic.
Thank you so much. It sounds so great on paper.
It's so extensive. My goodness, you've devoted your life to this. So thank you. We also have Nina Coslov with us today. Nina is actually bridging the patient experience and the expert. She's going to speak on both of those, but she did experience episodic dizziness on and off for years. And like many of us, navigated countless doctors and hypotheses, tried many therapies, and wondered about the relationship of her dizzy symptoms to hormonal changes. Nina Coslov created Women Living Better. Please check it out. It is an organization that provides anticipatory guidance about perimenopause. Intent on better characterizing the path to menopause, Nina focuses on education and research. Nina and her research partners have published 7 papers in peer-reviewed journals and she was the lead author on symptom experience during the late reproductive stage and the menopause transitions, observations from the Women Living Better survey, published in the Journal of Menopause. She also authored the chapter Women's Voices, the lived experience of the path to menopause in Each Women's Menopause, an evidence-based resource. Nina received the 2021 Media Award from the North American Menopause Society. Welcome, Nina. Thank you so much for joining us today.
I'm happy to be here. I can't wait to share and learn.
Me too. Well, let's dive in. And we always, with every episode, begin with a little bit of the patient experience. So, Nina, can you just get us started by telling us about your experience of dizziness and how it lived in you?
Sure. So the first, episodic is a really good word to describe my kind of pathway here. And I went back to my dizzy folder to kind of chart this so I could tell this in a succinct way. But the first kind of episode began for me in 2003. In the spring of 2003, it lasted about 2 to 3 weeks. I was 32 at the time. And I'll come back to that, but it basically didn't turn up for me for another 7 years. And then 7 years later, I have sort of December, January 2010, 2011. I then was like 39, 40. That was another kind of 3-week episode. And then not until May, June 2011, and then the summer, and all the way through kind of September of 2012, kind of 2 to 3 4-week episodes. And then another 6 years went by, nothing. And then again in April, May 2018. And then interestingly, it's popped up a little bit again last week, which I hadn't told you. But you know, until 2018, I wasn't thinking at all about perimenopause or hormonal related anything. But looking back on this, it's really interesting to me and the linkages I see. So in May of that first episode, May of 2003, I had just stopped nursing my first child and I was back at work. And all of these have been kind of exacerbated. There's something for me that is visual. It's a visual dizziness. I always say, I'm not rocking on a boat. The room is not spinning. It's something. I know it's something in my brain, but it's something, it's exacerbated by, fluorescent lights in big box stores, highways where there's, signage that's like going by really fast, particularly if it's night and there's like a reflection. So, the linkage to stopping nursing, I think, is interesting. And then kind of 7 years go by, and then I'm 39, right? And this easily could be the beginning of shifting hormonal patterns as I look back. And also as I look back at these, I hadn't even thought about it until I was kind of preparing to kind of share this. 2 to 3 weeks is about a menstrual cycle, right? If you take out the menses itself. And, the way these things happen, right, I think there's these sort of seismic shifts and then our body tries to get back into homeostasis and then, something else goes. So it's very interesting. I'm 53 now. And last week I spend a lot of time on the computer all the time. And last week I was doing this all day webinar and doing some other stuff at the same time. And all of a sudden I was like, oh my gosh, here it is again. Like I was like, I got to look away. I've got to get away from my screen. And so I left the webinar and I'd say for the last 4 or 5 days, my eyes are again in this, it's like a vulnerable, sensitive time. And so, I'm going to be hitting, I've got to be getting towards menopause at sometime soon. And because I do all this other sort of tracking of my sleep and my hormones, I know that things are very erratic for me. So that's kind of the kind of history of the intermittent. And it's mostly been sort of that, I call it sort of a visual dizziness, like when you have a drink or two and it's the first bit of a buzz or, in your head sort of feels good. It's caused me to, not drink for a long time because it's like that became very unpleasant. And I remember initially sort of sighting around being like, wait a minute, like what's going on? Like trying to just make sure that nothing was moving, like in the background, it's a visual definitely a visual thing for me. A couple of times I felt lightheaded, but I'd say 90% of it has been like a visual disturbance kind of thing.
I love how well you've tracked this. I think this is really, I want to hear, Maja, what you have to say about this, because it's absolutely fascinating. And I too, I don't know if I told you, Nina, but my first dizzy episode started at 39. So, and I was definitely experiencing some hormonal changes, not just female hormones, but thyroid changes as well. So anyway.
Well, I'm interested to hear from Dr. Scrakic. How did you get involved in researching the effects of menopause on vestibular patients?
Well, I think mostly for me, it was just the experience of the amount of patients that I was seeing with dizziness. And I don't want to fool anyone. My training was purely surgical. As some of you may know, neurotology is a surgical field. It's not actually a medical field. And so I didn't have a lot of experience with dizziness, but what I ended up seeing was just a wide array of patients. I see both pediatric, adult, and then geriatric patients at the span of their life, both women and men. And what I was seeing was that the patients with dizziness that I was getting, that sort of peak was at this sort of perimenopausal or menopausal time for women specifically. And so I just realized there was a very large underserved population, basically, where they're coming in for dizziness, people not really understanding where this dizziness is coming from or how the hormones influence this, and then what they can do for treatment. So it was more sort of the curiosity of how do I help patients, even in the case that I don't have formal training in this. And so then my research mainly became sort of clinical in a way that I was looking at the trends in my patients and the kinds of treatments that worked, and then sort of correlating that to the basic science research to understand the effects either way. So that's sort of how the interest was there because of the need. It wasn't something that I personally, started. This isn't why I entered neurotology or why I started doing this, but it was sort of where I was needed. And I think, just from a doctor's perspective, your job or your calling is to help people. And if this is what's coming through your door, then you do what needs to be helped, right?
Yeah.
So
And I'm
I
so
think
glad that you've
go
said
ahead.
it is coming from the need. And even though there isn't a lot of research out there, I don't have enough fingers to count the number of women that have said it gets worse during ovulation, it gets worse before my period, got worse during, I mean, there's definitely in our own lived experience that there is a correlation here. And like you said, Nina, as well, you have suspicions about this in your research, and the things that you've shared on women living better. I know that this hypothesis is something that's very real for you. Did it ever come up with your care providers? Because you were having these suspicions. Did you bring it up with them? And if you did, how did they respond?
So, the initial whole workup, I mean, I've been through so many not crazy tests, but some crazy tests, like the flip table. I mean, really, like, trying to figure out what this is, allergy, heart monitor, all types of stuff. But the whole first episode, where I was in the vestibular, lab or whatever it was, that was before I had any suspicions and I wasn't on to this whole idea of perimenopause. But the way that it, I think, from a provider perspective has been linked was to migraines. Now, I never had really, really severe migraines, but I sort of a little bit of family history. I had a grandmother that had really bad migraines. I've had a couple, but not like many of my friends that have migraines that carry around, prevention. I never had that. I could always kind of, go to bed, turn the lights off, put something cold on my head, and it would be gone the next day. But that became the default diagnosis after seeing lots and lots of providers. I think it was sort of like the absence of something else, which I was fine with. There are a lot worse things that it could have turned out to be, but it's the absence of the headache, but the dizziness. But in a lot of my notes, and actually last week too, I do feel like a head pressure sometimes when I have the dizziness. So it's not the killer migraine, like on one side that makes you want to like close an eye or not walk up the stairs, but there is a little bit of a headache. So I think that in a way, because we do know from research that that migraineurs have worse migraines in perimenopause, and then they subside after your final menstrual period. And so that to me is a kind of consistent story. It was never discussed with the provider, like, hey, this is hormonal. But I think, just it certainly in the later episodes, I think that was kind of like, you're a woman of a certain age and this could be happening. And if you had a history of migraine. So it wasn't explicit in terms of talking to my providers.
That makes sense.
Well, let's talk about hormones specifically. Dr. Svrakic, some research suggests that low estrogen levels may put patients at risk for developing vestibular disorders or trigger symptoms in otherwise predisposed people. Can you explain why this occurs? What is that connection?
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about sort of the actual hormones, and then let's talk about the kinds of disorders, that are going to be giving vestibular symptoms. So first things first, the major hormone that's driving menopausal changes is going to be the drop in estrogen. And so what happens sort of on the physical level for the woman is that there's going to be some changes in menstruation. That's usually the beginning of the drop of estrogen. And at some point in time, you will have your last period. And that period where the estrogen is dropping is really the perimenopause. As estrogen drops, there is a hormone inside your pituitary gland that is alerted to try and keep the estrogen levels up. So that hormone, the luteinizing hormone, starts secreting. And then it makes your ovaries try and secrete more estrogen, but there's not a lot of stuff there to secrete anymore. So it's kind of like a faulty hormonal factory at that point. But it's sort of driving it to produce more. And so you're basically on this roller coaster where you have a depletion of estrogen, your luteinizing hormone secretes more, it goes to your ovaries, they kind of squeeze out whatever they can, and then they kind of keep, dying out in that way. And so I think it's important not only to understand what that hormonal change is, to then think about, well, what are we really looking at? But you also want to look at the disorders, and you also want to look at what is the goal of your body in this drop of estrogen. And I don't want to get too philosophical, and if you need to cut me off on this one, you can. And I think Nina probably is with me on this one, but it's really thinking about, why is this happening? What is the role of a post-fertile woman in society, right? Why are we still alive and not being able to produce for half of our lives? That is a very unusual thing for a species to have. And so why is that? And the reason why is there is an advantage of having older, wiser women. They're the keepers of wisdom. And again, to just go a little bit off tangent, when we look at primates, the reason why primate groups are more successful are the ones that have older females who are post-fertile, who hold the wisdom of society, who then know where the best food is, who have experience. If you get into a war with this competing ape troop, this is what's going to happen. And so I think it's important for women to understand why these changes are happening. They're happening because you are unable to reproduce anymore, but you're still valuable. And let's talk about what those changes are. And those changes, again, if you just think about, well, what effects did it have? Well, it has neurological effects. Why does it have neurological effects? When you need to be childbearing and child rearing, you need to have certain behaviors that are conducive to that. Let's talk about the immune system. When you're growing a baby inside your body, when you're breastfeeding, you have to have immune system changes that allow literally an alien thing to live in your body and not to reject it, right? So there's immune system changes that happen. There's major metabolic effects on your bones, on your musculoskeletal system, because you have to somehow reprogram your body to say, I will now draw out all the nutrients that I need for me into this fetus, right? So, of course, there are going to be major changes, and estrogen and progesterone are the major drivers of all of these changes. And so, if you think about, why do hot flashes happen? It's a vasomotor symptom. It's a symptom that causes your heart rate to increase, your temperature to rise. And that's all happening because there's like this sudden burst of estrogen. And why is it happening? Well, if you think about, well, if I need to have just evolutionary a fetus or to protect the young, right? Like you need to be alert. You need to have an alert system to protect your babies or to protect your family. And so these changes and these hormonal changes are ancient and they exist for a reason, but they mess with us, right? They mess with our whole bodies, they mess with our brains, they mess with our immune system. And then you have to sort of understand, well, what disorders are we talking about? And then I'll just jump to the disorders. So, Meniere's disease, it's a disorder technically of electrolytes and fluid in your inner ear. But if you think of the amount of fluid changes that have to happen during pregnancy, during exchange of fluids, during breastfeeding, all of these things, hormonal will influence the inner ear. If you think about vestibular migraine, what Nina's talking about, it doesn't have to be a headache. Migraine can also be an alteration of sensation. So all the things that affect you neurologically are going to affect that. If other disorders such as BPPV, benign positional vertigo, has been linked to estrogen levels, and there is a thought because estrogen increases bone resorption. So basically, as you age, some of the bone loss happens. That bone resorption can happen in the inner ear, and then you can form the little otoliths and otoconia that cause crystals in the inner ear. Malden embarkment syndrome is also a thing that can happen more in menopause. It's a very specific syndrome of feeling like you're on a moving object without actually being on there. And that can also happen because of hormonal changes, again, in your neurological processing. So I know I spoke for a long time, but my point here is to say there's a reason why these hormonal changes happen. And there's also a reason how they influence each of those different disorders. And then when you're trying to treat or trying to figure out why it's happening, that's sort of where you should be looking at.
One thing I just like to add to that, I spend a lot of time sharing there's a chart from a 17 paper that looked at one woman 180 days, her daily urine. And actually in perimenopause, your estrogen is really fluctuating. So it ends up declining, right? But it's like going up and down and up and down. And I think a lot of what like the study of women's health across the nation and other research is learning is that it's this drop in estrogen, but it's happening so many times. So it's one of the reasons that this, but so many other things in perimenopause are really hard to treat because it's a moving target, right? And so, even like hormone therapy for perimenopause is tricky because you can treat hot flashes, but then your ovary might kick in and produce normal periods for another 6 months or a year. So it's interesting to think about. I wish I had been tracking all this time to kind of correlate these 6-year periods where things were relatively stable. And then all of a sudden, it's like, a perturbation to the system, right? And then again, something comes up and then back to homeostasis. And so that chart, I send people, I have it on the site, because so many people look at that and say, that's the way I feel. This like up and down and up and down, right? Progesterone's declining, estrogen's going up and down. It's a very kind of tumultuous time, hormonal.
And that makes so much sense now, that the way you both explain that, and the fluctuations, whether it's breastfeeding or whether it's preparing for a fetus, or whether it's preparing for the next phase of your life where you'll be doing more nurturing and wisdom sharing. Those fluctuations are unlike a man. We don't have this homeostasis until, and maybe I'm even wrong, but until menopause. Or are there fluctuations still even happening during menopause? And I'm assuming that it flattens out a little bit. Is that right?
Yeah, in menopause, it just levels off basically. Yeah, they're post-menopause technically is the term to describe once your estrogen has come to a full low. And then you're just calm the whole time. And you're just able to be wise.
There are women, though, who continue to have hot flashes into post after their final menstrual period, postmenopausally, because some estrogen is still produced in fat tissue and other places, and so. But for most, my hope is, and I try to give that good message that migraines and things related to migraines, most things calm down postmenopausally.
Wow. So is it a matter, Nina, I mean, is it a matter of just waiting it out? Because if those all, I mean, how do we do hormone therapy if, you're getting these surges and we can't track that?
Well, hormone therapy is my least favorite topic. And since I'm not an expert, I'm going to be kind of careful there. But I think from a woman's perspective, it's understanding that those fluctuations and being willing to try and tweak things and know that you're going through these different times. So something may start, it may not work the whole way. I think it's why many providers use the birth control pill, again, for women, because that basically just takes over the system and kind of stops, shuts down your normal production of hormones, and you don't ovulate. And so it's a way to kind of dampen all of this. I think the Mirena IUD is also a way that kind of calms the system. But, I personally, I wish I knew what kind of pulled me out of these things. We talked about it a little bit, Kimberly, before. But the thing that I have done consistently is kind of take the, more sleep, less alcohol, like all of those things to kind of, I think of it as like helping my body get back to homeostasis, right? If it's working to get back to homeostasis, what can I do to help that, right? I mean, reducing stress, like good luck. I mean, this is a really tough time of life. Perimenopause meets life is like, so, but there are some things we can control, and I've done a lot of those, and I sort of watch my sleep more closely and see what things affect that. So I don't have any great answers. It's tricky. Treating perimenopausal women on many dimensions is really tricky. I always say, but it's so much better to know. It's better to know that that's what this is, because there are so many other worse things. This is a normal life transition. It will calm down. There are things you can do in kind of the self-care realm. You talk to other people, it's not just you, because there's a lot of other, right? Like the mental health component for those of us that have, grandmothers or aunts that have dealt with really severe mental health crises. Like that's really scary when you have the first mood changes, when you just stop sleeping out of nowhere, right? Knowing that it's normal. And that's really been the whole goal of what I've created as a non-medical person. It's normalizing and validating what people are experiencing.
Hugely normalizing and validating. It's invaluable to know that you're not alone and that you're not losing your mind.
Yeah, it definitely feels that way sometimes. I can tell you that. Dr. Svrakic, can you, in your practice, can you tell us what the role hormone therapy does play from a medical perspective in moderating or treating vestibular symptoms, or I guess let's just say in the menopause and perimenopause process?
Yeah, again, it's menopause is not a disorder. It's not a disease. It's a normal sort of process of aging for women, for human women, right? But what it does is it influences all these different disorders. So you have to really think about what disorder a patient has to understand then what is the role of hormone therapy going to be in it. I don't prescribe hormone therapy, but I have many patients who obviously have their OBGYNs who do that. And then we talk about sort of the effects. And sometimes I would advise them to either stop or start the therapy. So again, the major one is the estrogen replacement. All those, they're combination products that also focus on the progesterone replacement as well. And as I think all of you have commented on, it's really the fluctuation. So you're really sort of trying to level the patient off. The problem is, again, it's not the same for every patient. So what research has found and what I've seen is that if a woman is experiencing a lot of vasomotor symptoms, and that's defined as hot flashes, then hormone therapy may help not just with the vasomotor symptoms, but also with the dizziness symptoms. But if that is not a part of their experience, even though the hormones are fluctuating, hormone replacement therapy won't help. And then the other problem is that for every study and every patient that you have, one thing is true, you will find a study that will say the opposite is true. So just to give you an example for that is they try to do hormone replacement therapy for women who are postmenopausal. So their estrogen levels are depleted. And what happens in older people, not just women, but in general, is that your balance decreases and you have an increased risk of falls. And so they said, well, is estrogen the key in this? Can we just increase estrogen, give women estrogen, and then see how they do? Well, on the one hand, you have a study that shows that something called posturography, but basically a way to sort of measure a person's balance by either having them close their eyes or moving a platform to try and see how they sort of deal with that challenge. And on the one hand, on this short study where they gave 2 weeks of estrogen transdermally and then a little combo estrogen progesterone product, the women had less falls and had better balance if their estrogen was maintained. On another study, so this was one done in Europe, this one was done in America. The one that was done in America didn't show that effect at all. It said it was not protective in any way. People still had the same amount of falls and decrease in balance, whether or not you give them estrogen. And I think it's hard because there's some things that happen in a lab, and then there's other things that happen in real life. And what happens in real life, it's not just the menopause, it also is the aging process that happens to men and women and everyone else. And sometimes it's hard to discern, is it just the estrogen and progesterone level, or is it all the other things that happen with aging? Your cognitive abilities slow down, your vision decreases, the sensitivity of your ears to the outside environment decreases. So it's not a cookie cutter approach, but again, for patients that have vasomotor symptoms, hormone replacement therapy can help. But for patients who don't, it's likely not going to help. And there is no clear data that it will help with balance just on its own. I think balance exercise or other therapies would help with that.
So just to clarify, Maja, so because I know everyone that's listening to this is dizzy. So if they don't have any hot flashes, you don't recommend hormone therapy. If they're
Correct.
only experiencing dizziness in their perimenopause/menopause phase.
Correct. If they do not have the hot flashes, just to put it plainly, if they don't have hot flashes, hormone replacement therapy will likely not help their dizziness symptoms. I would not advise them to do that. And any
Interesting.
new I just recently had a patient who just started a hormone replacement therapy, a mixture of estrogen and progesterone. Immediately after that, hypersensitive to light, motion, headache, dizziness, cannot go to work. She's a school teacher. And I said, it's clearly that was the change. You started this therapy on Sunday, it's Monday, and you have these symptoms. But she was really sort of adamant about keeping the hormone replacement therapy. And so what I'm
Wow.
saying is, you've got to sort of be careful because it can certainly worsen symptoms as well. Again, depending on what kinds of symptoms are bothering them.
So there can be downsides to the hormone replacement therapy.
100%. Yeah. You have to, don't wed yourself to that as the treatment at all.
That's very important to hear. I just finished reading The Upgrade, and the author who also wrote Women. I'm forgetting that first book that she wrote, but she's a neuropsychiatrist, I believe, and I think she highly recommended hormonal replacement specifically to protect later in life dementia. That there was that period of time where the estrogen can really protect the brain, but it's important for the vestibular community to hear what you just said, so we don't all run out and get that for the later in life dementia. Meanwhile, we might be exacerbating our symptoms in the interim. So,
and Kimberly, I'll just add again, there are, just like Maja said, there are equal studies that show that hormone therapy causes harm in the cognitive realm. People are getting very excited about, again, there's this pendulum that swings between hormone therapy is the best thing ever, and it's the worst thing ever. And on the cognitive front, I know that there are some really big population studies that show harm in terms of dementia, and there's other people saying it's the best thing. So again, I think you just have to look at all the data. And what drives me crazy about this discussion, and what on behalf of women I get so frustrated, is the people who love it only talk about the studies that show benefit, and the people who don't like it only talk, and it's really, really confusing. I did an interview with a woman named Pauline Mackey, who I think offers a pretty balanced perspective. so I try to find those people that will talk about both and say, well, in this study, just like Maja did, in this study it showed this, but in these studies it showed harm, and we don't know. And there's different regimens, and there's different formulations. There's there's estradiol, and there's conjugated estrogens, and there's progestins and progesterone. Anyway, all of those things have a factor, and I would say we don't know yet. Nobody should, it's. I don't know how you feel, Maya. You're probably reading this, but it's.
Yeah, I think not only is it hard to control again for what are the effects of aging on a human being versus what are the effects of menopause, the other thing that people largely sort of don't want to talk about because I think ends up being kind of political is really the length of time that women are on birth control. When you're on birth control, you really are suppressing your endogenous hormones and you're just sort of taking exogenous hormones for the purpose of birth control, for the purpose of women having control over their bodies, for the purpose of all these things that are good. And so I think once you touch birth control, you're very politically sort of attacked. And I think no one talks about the bad effects of birth control. And perhaps if you're living constantly suppressing your hormone levels to be flat, once you come to this perimenopausal period where things are fluctuating, you don't deal with fluctuations as well. And so again, I think that when you
Wow.
do these studies, you're not really controlling for the population, the people that you're studying. What was the length of their birth control? What kind of birth control was it? And that definitely has affected your hormonal axis throughout your life. And women are commonly in birth control for 30 years of their life, right? So we can't say that there's no effect.
Yeah. So Nina, going back to what we can control, you talked about lifestyle. I know at sleep is a huge one for me. I found that even like I mentioned before that we started recording, I was just at a birthday party in Colorado and I was not going to bed at 9 like I religiously have done since I started getting dizzy. And I ended up just taking for me, hydroxyzine is like an antihistamine, and it's a temporary fix, but it really helps me just secure that good night's sleep. And if I don't get that, I can guarantee you it's going to be harder to recover from the dizziness, the subsequent days. So, what else, Nina, have you found for yourself and in your research?
Yeah, I mean, so it mostly the research. I mean, what I will say is like when we did this really big study, I did include when we looked at like 82 different symptoms. I was all keen on I put in dizzy in 3 ways. I did the like rocking on a boat. I did the feel like I'm going to pass out. And about 20% of people endorse that, both in the late reproductive stage. That's kind of before you've entered perimenopause officially, but that's sort of while you're having regular periods. That's sort of the focus of my research and the website is really normalizing and validating that all of these things can start before your periods are irregular, right? Because that's sort of where I think women are getting the word is dismissed, but and I don't want to throw healthcare providers under the bus because we don't have the research to tell them that it's happening either. But it's traditionally that's where the rub happens. So a whole bunch of things start happening, whether it's mood or dizziness or sleep, and then you go to your healthcare provider and like, are you still getting a regular period? And you say yes, and they say, well, then that's not perimenopause. And that is sort of the whole genesis of where this happened for me and why I wasn't thinking of anything hormonal, because we discount that this could start at 40, if you're still having regular periods. So but in terms of so sleep, I think hydration, and again, I don't know what like less alcohol. I don't know what exactly kind of takes me out of these. But I also want to just mention there's, for me, the dizziness, and then there's the anxiety about the dizziness. And that for me I really, really had to decouple those. So I also began some different meditation practices and, like just more walking and yoga. I've tried so many things and I do them for a short time, but I always kind of come back around because I really do think it's sort of like my default mode network in my brain is when I can't control something to get anxious about it. Right. And at the time when this first started, I had like 3 young kids, and all of these, now they all drive, but it was always like, oh my gosh, 3 of them have to be in 3 different places. I'm driving 4 carpools. Like, what if I'm dizzy, right? And so that became such an anxiety producing thing. And so winding back that part of it for me, and I think that just exacerbated my dizziness. It's hard to, again, unwind those, but I think finding ways to kind of calm your sympathetic nervous system, I think throughout perimenopause, particularly with respect to vestibular things, but other symptoms as well. Taking the step back. It is a normal time in life, and it's good for all of us to have ways to kind of unwind our anxiety for whatever is kind of a trigger for us. So, and again, I've tried so many different things that it's hard for me to say this is the thing. And I don't think there is one thing for everyone. I think you have to sort of, it's been a time of really kind of getting to know myself and getting to know my body much better. I really never paid attention to my periods or my cycles or understood how they worked. And now I pay so much close attention, and I feel like I've learned so much, and that's given me some kind of sort of an element of control and knowledge. It doesn't make it all go away, but I just feel kind of more knowledgeable about it and accepting of this, like this tumultuous time. Again, I go back to, I just picture that graph and I'm like, yep, that's how I feel. That's sort of what's going on in my body and my brain, and it will end. And how can I help it kind of, calm down?
And that acceptance you talk about is so key to allowing the anxiety to not exacerbate the dizziness. We did an episode with Dr. Yonit Arthur, and she talks a lot about how, patients that have higher panic disorder or anxiety that accompany the dizziness tend to have longer episodes or endless episodes, whereas the ones that are like, I'm dizzy, whatever.
That's fascinating, because I would say my worst one was, I did develop some panic around it, and it was around this driving thing. And I had a couple dizzy episodes while I was driving. And then I think they sort of they started connecting for me. Like my brain started like, I was like, I'd be in the car thinking like, am I getting dizzy? Oh no. Like, right. And then I'm sure I was exacerbating it. And that was the one, like at the height of, everybody had a carpool going, and, driving other kids. I started thinking like, I can't drive other kids. Like, this is not safe, And so that also definitely spun things up. So that's fascinating that like the more you worry, the more the dizziness lasts. Cause that, if all of mine were kind of 2 to 3 weeks, and then this one here was like 8 or 9 weeks, right? It's like, oh, maybe that's exactly what I had done there.
So, when I was going through menopause, I was seeing a nutritionist, and I was on hormone therapy, and she was trying to get me to wean myself off hormone therapy through nutritional management, managing my diet. Dr. Scrakic, do you have any thoughts about nutrition or other types of lifestyle changes that you recommend to patients during this time?
I do, and I think you should separate, and sometimes they come together, but the two real sort of components of dizzy disorders is something called hyperreactivity and then hypersensitivity. And I'm glad that Nina touched on both. But hypersensitivity means, think of what a trigger could possibly be for you. Say that a trigger for your either a headache or a dizziness symptom would be bright light. That's a simple one to think about. So that your threshold is very low, right? That's what hypersensitive means. That for you, even if you see a little bit of a brighter light than normal, you become sensitive to that and you start having symptoms. So that's hypersensitivity, where your threshold of activation is low. Hyperreactivity is, and then what happens to your body is that, say that you saw a little bit of a brighter light, and then something happened in your body where the response was a little bit out of proportion than what you would expect. If you think of it as a startle reflex or something like that, right? Like that many things startle you, but then you just sort of calm down, versus not just that the many things startle you, but what they startle you, you work yourself up so high that it's really hard to sort of calm down. So if you think of vestibular disorders in an hypersensitive inner ear and brain sort of organ system, and then the hyperreactive, this adrenaline sort of axis, then you can really sort of think about, well, what lifestyle changes would help either one of those or both, if that's what you're dealing with. So for the hypersensitive is sort of what we talk about, the migraine diet, but I just use it for any sort of hypersensitivity disorders, including Maldenbarkment. But that would be very specifically changes in caffeine intake and keeping the caffeine intake very regular if you do caffeine, and being very careful of hidden caffeines. Alcohol is a really big one, any kind of alcohol, but especially anything that has to do with food degradation. So that would be wine, would be, or beer, yeast would be one of those. Chocolate, nuts, peanut butter, all the good stuff. Avocados, onions, citrus fruit, bananas. Um, Processed meats, any of the artificial sweeteners are really sort of big on this. So really anything that you think of, like cheeses, aged cheeses, anything that has the aging process in there. So that would be yeast, cheese, wine, beer, those kinds of things. And anything that has a mimics a neurotransmitter that's particularly pleasurable. So unfortunately, bananas, avocados, chocolate, they mimic neurotransmitters in our brain. And actually, those are the things that can make you more sensitive. So you can really go down the diet list, and that's readily available. It's called the migraine diet. Um, and I know there's a lot of people on Vita who talk about this as well, but basically that's to decrease the sensitivity. And then dietary wise, for decreasing sort of the hyperreactivity, is just things that are good for the heart. So you can really think about what that is, low sodium, healthy fats, sort of the Mediterranean diet will be things that would help with that sort of hyperreactivity. But then what helps with other things that would help? So sleep, always good, right? So keeping sleep consistent, a really important aspect of sleep in both hyperreactivity and hypersensitivity is exact timing of sleep. Like when you go to bed, like Kimberly was saying, 9 religiously, and when you wake up. But really key here is that you get the same amount of hormones dose through your sleep, right? Because your sleep cycle is every hour and a half is you get release of your growth hormone, you get release of all these other hormones in your body that you're not thinking about, not just female hormones. And it's if you're not sleeping in these hour and a half intervals, you're actually missing some of those doses. So what does that mean? Hour and a half intervals for, women our age. 6 is the really bare minimum you should be sleeping. 7.5 is like golden. Like that is the time. But if you have the option of sleeping 7 hours or 6, go down to 6. Do not sleep the 7 hours because of that hour and a half sort of 90-minute hormonal cycle that happens. So sleep is, if you regulate sleep, you can really fix a lot of problems. The problem is sometimes it's really hard to regulate sleep. And a lot of
Yeah.
sort of, I know for me, perimenopausal, I have hot flashes, I can't fall asleep, anxiety through the roof. I'm just like, I'm struggling. So sometimes just the consistency of sleep is the thing that you have to sort of work back and figure out what is it that's going to get me to sleep. So consistent sleep, dietary changes that we talked about. Magnesium is a big one that's overlooked. Magnesium glycinate is a pretty popular one, but increasing, not that you're magnesium deficient, but just increasing magnesium helps a lot of the vestibular disorders. Um, and then stress is a big one. And again, sometimes you have to really think about, like, is this just sort of everyday stress? Can I remove myself from these situations? And what are my coping mechanisms? And if you can't, then you have to figure out how to deal with stress. So mindfulness, meditation, even sometimes going on medications that deal with stress, would be helpful.
Let me just, you just struck a thought when you were talking about the the hypersensitivity and hyperreactivity. Is there like and then could we add there, if it's like a Venn diagram, like that the fluctuating estrogen is also like a vulnerable window, right? When your hormones are doing this, I mean, that is like, as I'm like thinking about this and going back, like what was different about last week? Like I sit on webinars all the time, but there was something about, and what I didn't say is this. So this was like Thursday, and then I got my period and my shortest cycle in like years 2 days later. So definitely hormones were dropping for me. And that kind of intuition that I have now, because I'm tracking all these things so closely, like that's becoming part of my story here, right? That it's like, it's the fluctuation, it's the drop in estrogen. So it's not low all the time, but it's the drop that makes me more sensitive to lights. I mean, I'll go a couple years and then I'll walk into a Target and be like, oh my God, these lights are driving me crazy. And so it's not always, but there's some kind of vulnerability that happens, right? And then it kicks on the sensitivity and then my reactivity. So I think, as you said, like if you can work on all of those things, there's some level of a little bit of control there.
it's almost like certain things line up, and for those 2 years, they're not lining up, like your
Yeah.
cycle and the Target shopping
Yeah.
aren't lining up, and then one day
Yeah.
they do.
Or the all-day webinar or something, something else. And I'm like, what is going on here? And I know it. I know that feeling the minute it happens. And then I think again, this goes to the perspective of like, this is not going to last forever. Here comes some dizziness. Like, right. Again, you have to have these like ways of saying to yourself, like, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go outside for a walk. These things work. I have some control. But when this first happens, you're thinking, oh my gosh, like this,
Yeah.
uh, it's
Yeah,
silly.
it's easy. It's not easy. It's not easy to say this isn't going to last forever, and this too will pass. And I can tell you, looking back, having, as I said, been paused and looking back, now I can say, oh yeah, that was something that was temporary, and now life is back to what we call normal. But I can also say, I think one of the difficult things is not just experiencing, but communicating it with the other people in your life. Your spouse, your partner, your family, your friends, and people that you're working with. Because especially, an opposite sex partner is not going to get what you're going through. And we can look, my husband and I can look back at it and kind of laugh that was my crazy period, but going through it wasn't so fun.
So I do
My
want to just give a shout out to the men. The men go through a vestibular migraine disorders and Meniere's disease and all the other problems, but why it's easier for them is they don't have their hormonal fluctuations in the background. That's one variable that they don't have to deal with. So that, it's not that men don't get these disorders, they do, but as is exactly as you pointed out, Cynthia, is they just don't get the fluctuations, and then they're like, well, like, what do you mean? If you control your diet and your sleep, like, shouldn't you be fine? And you're like, well, no, because I got this like crazy.
So one of the things, Maya, I'm actually curious about this, and I know a lot of other patients, including those that have MDDS like myself, are on Effexor, and I'm on Effexor, and it's been about 2 years now, and it's greatly helped. And my physician told me that there's an off-label property to Effexor that actually helps increase estrogen. I want to know, have you heard that? And or if is it correct, or what are your thoughts about that?
I don't know that like particular study offhand, but I can certainly tell you from experience that a very large subset of my patients does well in Effexor, and a very large subset. Again, my practice is everyone, but I do see a lot of middle-aged women with vertigo, and I specifically see women with this sort of both hypersensitive and hyperreactive. And the reason why Effexor is a really nice thing that works is because it works for the hyperreactivity part. That's when it's also used for anxiety and panic disorders, but it also works really well for the hypersensitivity part, which is why it's used for vestibular migraines.
Hmm.
And so Effexor to me is, it definitely can work in women, but it's also I don't know its effect on estrogen, but I can assume and tell you that there's no, like nothing definitive. And if you sort of looked at studies that looked at a different hormone, they may sort of show effect on that too. So I wouldn't pay too much credit to that one
Yeah.
particular study. I would just say that Effexor is very effective in treating both hyperreactive and hypersensitive
So the other
symptoms.
thing that I can add, Kimberly, is Effexor, that venlafaxine. Is that right? Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
So venlafaxine has been studied for hot flashes. And it is, if you look at the MS flash studies, you can also I have this on the website. If you go to the MS flash studies and you look at the curves of what is the closest to hormone therapy, but not hormonal therapy, this was before this new class of drugs came out last May, these NK3 inhibitors, neurokinin inhibitors, but venlafaxine does pretty well. So you may be getting an added bonus. So that might be where somebody was linking it to estrogen. I don't actually think that it's increase. Anyway, I bet that's the tie-in in somebody's mind, because venlafaxine has shown to do pretty well with hot flashes.
That's fascinating.
I can
Wow.
send that. I can give you that link.
Yeah.
Is there other research, either Nina or Maya, other research out there that that you're aware of that you could share that might be, in the future, something that will help vestibular patients as they are transitioning through menopause?
I'm not aware of that much in the vestibular world. Honestly, I was hoping Maya was, because I've done some searches in PubMed, and I don't see much that's tied to perimenopause or hormonal fluctuations, except that lots of women present at this time of life with dizziness, and so.
Yeah, exactly. So that's the problem is the basic science research is lacking. And then you have to sort of think about, well, what are you going to gain from basic science research? And if it says, well, if you give this substance to guinea pigs, they're going to be going through, I don't know, more dizzy or less dizzy spells, it's not really translatable into human research, right? And then when you think about human research, again, it's very hard to sort of parse out like what changes are exactly happening. Like I said, variables such as, well, your age could be a factor, but also how much you've used birth control or how other metabolic disorders such as diabetes are affecting all of this. So there's a lot of confounding variables, and you're not going to find that research. So what you sort of have to do is step back instead of trying to like look at like one molecule affecting this other molecule. You have to kind of step back and figure out, well, what is it that we're trying to treat, right? Like, what are we trying to treat numbers like in hormone numbers? Or are you trying to treat the person as a whole? Like, what is it that's affecting them? How do you get them to be most functional? How do you get them to, uh, drive their 3 kids around and not be dizzy at the same time, right? Like that is the thing that you're trying to fix. And so to me, looking at every single study individually is really not going to help this. I think what's going to help more is having a more holistic approach. And what's unfortunate is that you're not going to find a lot of practitioners that do that because, in a way, it's also like a behavioral therapist or a cognitive behavioral therapist problem or thing to solve, but it's also a medical doctor's thing to solve and an endocrinologist and an OBGYN. And then you have the neurotologist who, you know, I think I'm running a reputation now of the of the inner ear psychologist or whatever you want to call it, but I basically am dealing with 3 symptoms that people don't want to deal with: earfulness, dizziness, and tinnitus. And the reason why they don't want to deal with is because these are non-surgical problems and because they're problems that are affecting you as a whole, and no practitioner is dealing with you as a whole. And so again, you're not going to find like this cutting edge research on one medication. It's going to be, I think, just acceptance that it's a complex problem and that you need to have a lot of people sort of solving it at once.
Yeah, I think, thank you for taking a holistic approach. It's really refreshing to hear. And I think that the good news about that, people when they're not feeling well, they want a pill to make it better. But the good news about the holistic approach is that it empowers you to do that you can do something to improve your well-being now and into the future by all of the lifestyle changes that we've talked about, that there is hope, and you have the power to control that to some extent.
Yeah. And even if the research isn't there yet, even what Nina has created with Women Living Better, there's a place to go for women to read survey results and hear about women's reported symptoms and know that they're not alone and know that this is common. And then they can, see it as a phase and relax their nervous systems, all of that. So I think, Nina, the work the two of you are doing together is actually, they really complement each other well.
Absolutely. This has been one of the most educational conversations that we've had.
Oh my gosh. I want to listen to it again as soon as the recording's done. I learned so much. So thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Nina, Maya. Thank you so much for sharing your experience and your expertise and with our community. I know that we're gonna have a lot of people commenting on this one.
Yeah, I think this one might go viral.
Oh no. Oh no.
Yeah, blessing and a curse.
Yeah, I'm glad that you're recognizing, in general, vestibular disorders as disorders that are so common and very commonly undertreated and mistreated. And also that it's such an important role in women's lives, especially during these hormonal changes. It's so great to even have these conversations.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I'm just going to do one more call out for those of you who are out there listening who are going through hormonal changes or just have questions. There is an article on Vita's website about hormones and how they affect the vestibular system. So just go to vestibular.org, use the search button, put in hormones, and you'll find that there. Thank you so much again for joining us today. Good night. Thanks for tuning in to ICU this month.
We hope this conversation sparked new understanding of the vestibular journey. And for all of our patients out there, leaves you feeling just a little more heard and a little more seen. I see you.